of Cape Falcon Marine Reserve, which is Oregon's northernmost and newest marine reserve and is located just off of Oswald West State Park. And we do outreach and education through hikes, lectures, boat tours, and other community events. And we also organize community science in the Marine Reserve, including seabird monitoring with Portland Audubon. So if you're interested in learning more about us or getting involved, you can visit our website at nehalemtrust.org/CapeFalconMR, subscribe to our email newsletter, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Tonight, I'm really excited to have Peter Hatch and John Goodell from the Elakha Alliance joining us to discuss the history and possible future of sea otters in Oregon. This is really interesting and exciting work that I've been following for a few years now. So Peter Hatch is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and works in the tribe's Cultural Resources Office. He is the son of the late David Hatch, the co-founder of the Elakha Alliance, and he serves on the board of directors as the secretary. So thank you for being here, Peter. And John Goodell is the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance. He's a conservation biologist and former museum curator with a background in science communication and natural history interpretation. So now I will kick it over to Peter to get started. Thank you so much.
All right, Chela Huiti. Peter Sagus Hatch, wa amnashi. Hello everyone. Peter Black Bear Hatch is my name. And I'm going to be talking a little bit this evening about Oregon's Elakha and kind of the shared fate between, Oregon's indigenous folks like myself, but also all of us and the sea otters that we once shared our waters with and hopefully will again. It's tough to know where to begin this very complex story, but I think that John is going to be talking a lot more to you about the biology and ecology of sea otters, but really at the root of it, so much of what I'm about to explain all stems from the fact that unlike other marine mammals along our coasts, like seals or sea lions, our friend, our cute sea otter buddy here has no layer of blubber to protect itself from the cold waters of the Pacific that it lives in, and so maintains the softest, densest fur in the world as an ecological adaptation to maintain a barrier of air between itself and the ocean water. And so much of its value and so much of the reasons for this story that I'm going to explain kind of just all stem from that one particular happenstance of biology. So we can begin this story at a sort of ending. In July of 1910, a man named George Forty shot an otter near Port Orford and went up to Coos Bay to have it appraised. An old otter hunter there thought it was worth maybe $500, which is about $13,000 adjusted for inflation. And so far as we know, as far as I've been able to find a record of, that is the last wild indigenous Oregon sea otter. Our population now stands at the three animals each between the Oregon Zoo and the Oregon Coast Aquarium, none of which, of course, originally come from Oregon. And to understand how we got there, there's a lot that goes into that. But in terms of how we understand ourselves as people and as stewards of our environment and the Oregon coast that we all care so much about, it becomes a difficult thing to understand how we weigh the importance of this species that has been gone for 110 years. And it turns out that that importance is huge. And to go back in time for our beginning, I think it makes sense for me to take our story over to the south of the mouth of Coos Bay, the Bastendorf Beach, Sunset Bay kind of area, which is where this woman here pictured, Hannes Koos elder named Annie Miner Peterson, told the story about a time back when the differences between humans and I suppose the human people and the animal people were not as clear cut as they are today. And a woman from a village there by the mouth of Coos Bay married a young chief of the Sea Otter people, and went to go live with his people out to sea, and brought her sons back with the wedding gifts for her parents to make the marriage good, and to solemnize it after a couple of years. And she explained that now that she had returned for a visit, this reciprocal relationship and these gifts from the sea that she brought would ensure the prosperity of the people going forward, as long as they saw her children, the sea otters, out playing and living beyond the waves. And that's what ended for us in 1910. And that's important to me in particular, and to indigenous folks up and down the coast, in part because of how we express that interrelatedness between us and the beautiful things and the plants and animals that sustain us and that we share our world with. And to ensure the continuance of that relationship is by making our regalia, making the things most precious to us out of the beautiful things that come from that environment. And that can be, the abalone shell, the woodpecker scarlet. But the single most valuable thing for in a lot of contexts would be the robes made from the pelts of these beautiful otters, sea otters to be specific. And in fact, they would be the way that a rich man who's going to be diplomatic, or a young bachelor who wanted to impress his future in-laws and solemnize a marriage would be to pay that wedding gift in the form of otter skins. And many elders from reservation days, long after the otters were gone, still talked about that. There's no evidence that sea otters were absent from anywhere on our coast. That before reservation days, our coast was a place of tremendous cultural and linguistic diversity, and here is the word for sea otter in all of the different languages along the coast. We could just as easily be the Ecological Alliance, but we happen to be the Elakha Alliance. And there are many indications that sea otters were abundant in across many sites. Our colleague on the Elakha Alliance, retired archaeologist Roberta Hall, notes in her work that sea otters are the second most common marine mammal bones in the middens, the accumulated refuse from our village sites up and down the coast. And so our people hunted them, but did so in a way that could be sustained, since time immemorial until recent centuries, when things began to spin out of control. And it's interesting the extent to which the techniques and the places that are talked about for harvesting sea otters, even in the memory of people who lived and were interviewed long after sea otters were gone from our coast, correlates basically one-to-one with where we would expect there to be good habitat now. And the mark that our former otter population left is still there on the landscape. Just to take two examples, we have Otter Rock in Lincoln County, or Otter Point down in Curry County. And I think it's quite likely that those have been important habitats for sea otters since basically as long as sea levels have been near their current level. Because if you go back to the original names for those places in Tillamook or in Dani, Ashihigil Shantish, or just means sea otter rock, and Khotash stay the same. So those relationships, that that interrelatedness is still is still in evidence after all this time of their absence. So to understand how we got from that relative equilibrium of sustainable hunting to that ending in 1910 that I talked about, we have to take our story actually to the Imperial Palace in St. Petersburg, and this woman here, Empress Anna, who her mother first, Catherine the Great, and then her sent the man on the right, Vitus Bering, off to explore the far eastern reaches of her new empire, and he dutifully did so. And tried to see if indeed her possessions stretched into the new riches that were being drawn out of North America, and kind of filling in this last kind of big question mark space on European maps. And Bering got an ocean and an island named after him, but he died in the attempt. But his men who returned noticed the fast canoes of the local people, the Aleut or Unangach folks, and how they were really the only ones who could successfully hunt the sea otter. And they found out pretty quickly how huge the profits could be for these fine furs at the northwesternmost or border port between Russia and China, and that was the thing that they could get for, or they could get people to trade for the silks and the tea that they could market back home, and so they did what the folks involved in the frontiers of big empires did the world over during these centuries, and enslaved the local Aleut folks in kind of ships full of work gangs that worked their way from island to island, and then further south along the coast, depleting the otter population and moving along. And basically, this was part of the driving force that brought our little windswept area of the edge of the Pacific into, under the gun, into the eyes of all of these European empires working their way across the world at the time, including the British, including the Spanish, working their way up from Mexico, and including American entrepreneurs like Robert Gray, looking for what opportunities they could find in this far-flung part of the world in their eyes. And so the Russians made it as far south as Fort Ross in California, and American ships sailing out of Boston went all the way around South America and back up the coast to trade the buttons and the beads made in Venice for our own furs to take to Canton, to get the tea and the silks that they could market back home. And so through this kind of grinding commercial boom, this huge maritime fur trade for the soft gold, as it was called, a lot of our original Oregon sea otter population probably ended up as the fringes of the robes of nobility in China and elsewhere, as you see in I forget which Qing Dynasty emperors. They're called the dragon robes here. So really, but by the time the American colonization turns their eyes into this area, a lot of the die has already been cast, but it was still a motivating factor. You know, in since we're met here at Fort Clatsop, I should note that Thomas Jefferson's original instructions to Lewis and Clark basically say, "Hey, while you guys are out there, you should really try and get a piece of the action that the Russians and the British are making so much money from." And so some of the accounts we have, like this picture from Harper's Magazine in 1855, is really just the process of killing those last few surviving otters after the Russians and the other maritime fur traders had taken from our coast most of what there was to take in terms of furs. And so as these kind of processes of empire made their way, they drove sea otters to extinction along big chunks of their range. You know, the whole California sea otter population descends from just 30 or so animals that managed to hang on a very remote pocket of the Big Sur coast, and we just happen not to be so lucky. And we're here in this big gap in their former range. So this grinding process that I talked about, of you know, enslaving Aleut folks for their labor and trading and bringing the exploitation and disease that goes along with that all along the Pacific coast. Well, as with other big economic booms and their downsides and their discontents in other parts of the world, that has a tendency to create orphans. And one such orphan was this man, Nick Hatch, from Alaska, who was sent down to Chemawa Indian School, where he met a local Siuslaw Indian girl named Hattie Martin, and they got married, and they are my great grandparents. And so the same, you know, I'm a particular example, but we're you know, met here on the grounds of an old fur trading post. This story is personal for all of us, and has a lot to do with why you know, what brings us all here together on our little corner of the Pacific. And indeed, this slide is just to talk about how you know, in the killing of those last few otters in the tail end of the 19th century and the earliest part of the 20th, tribal members certainly had as much culpability as anyone else, and were a lot of the people, you know, feeding their families as best they could off of these last few precious and endangered skins. But we have a way forward, and I think that intertwined history for all of us, and the way that the fur trade brought us all together here, creates a responsibility to do something, at least make the attempt to restore that ecological integrity and that sense that that sense of reciprocity between between ourselves and the plants and animals that we share our lands and waters with. And fortunately, we have a lot of opportunities. And to talk more about that and to go into detail, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to John. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen.
Okay, well, I hope you can hear me, and thanks again for inviting us to present here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ecological aspects and dimensions of sea otters and their loss, and then hopeful return, and then also a little bit of information about the Elakha Alliance. I have a fair amount of territory to cover, and so just bear with me here while I go through a few slides. So what I'm going to talk about today is why does the loss of sea otters matter, the state of kelp in Oregon, which is a really important story in context to this effort to return sea otters to Oregon, in addition to the cultural dimensions that Peter talked about. We're going to discuss the ecology of sea otters, what we expect the effects of the restoration of sea otters to be in the ecosystem, and then, and as I mentioned, the Elakha Alliance. But I wanted to start with the concept of diversity, and you may have heard in a lot of various folks talking about ecology and wildlife conservation. You talk about diversity, which is the number of species in a landscape is a good way to talk about diversity, biodiversity. We know biodiversity is important. But why is it important in the context of predators? I'll give a very simplistic example here of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. You have aspen habitat and willow habitat in the bottom part of your screen, and you've got grizzly bear and wolf in the top, and a couple different predators on the landscape. Of course, cougars are there too, and other predators. But just as an example here, two apex predators that have this cascading effect on habitat in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So their pressure that they put on elk and deer and other herbivores actually has a cascading effect and helps to sustain reasonably healthy and vibrant habitats of some of these key habitats like aspen, cottonwood, and willow. And so diversity is important, and it's important for just very pragmatic reasons. If you lose one predator, you have another one potentially that can exert some of the similar influence. And similarly, in the marine habitats, we have the sea otter and the sunflower sea star as two really important predators on the nearshore marine, essentially bottom of the nearshore marine habitats, where they are both predating on or preying on urchins, as an example. And so and they're also preying on other critters in the eelgrass habitat, or at least sea otters do. So the effects of sunflower sea star and the sea otter on kelp habitat and in eelgrass habitat has a similar importance, as it's a cascading effect essentially, and helps maintain the health of those two ecosystems. And Peter mentioned, the shift where we lost sea otters back in the beginning of the early part of the 20th century. And so we've had sea otters been missing from this ecosystem in Oregon for some time. And this sunflower sea star was really the redundancy in the system. And starting in about 2013 and 14, the sea star wasting disease popped up. It was a completely novel challenge that decimated the sea star populations across the Pacific range. And some of these species have rebounded, but not the sunflower sea star. And so the culprit, we think, or biologists, it's a very kind of confusing and challenging question, but what biologists believe is the cause is ocean warming, possibly ocean acidification, and that has sort of shifted something in the biochemistry essentially of the sea stars. And so the Pycnopodia sunflower sea star was listed as critically endangered or announced to be critically endangered by the International Union of Conservation of Nature. And they did a large population survey, and they discovered about a 90% decline, over 90% decline in sea star, in the Pycnopodia population, and a massive number of individuals lost. And there's been really no real indication of a recovery. So this is sort of an important ecological context to why sea otters might be really important to return to this system. So we have the shifting ecosystem. We're currently on the marine, if you go to the Oregon's nearshore marine environment, you do not have either one of those important apex predators. And we're seeing this new phenomenon of this expansion of purple sea urchin barrens, which, and we think, combined with ocean warming. So let's talk about urchins real quick. There's two different species. You have the red, and then you have the purple. And the purple is really the species that has been typically of low commercial value, smaller. It's typically found in shallow water. It's often seen at it's now seen at greater depths, and it's known to be more of an active grazer, so it outcompetes the red sea urchin in some cases. The red is the historical commercial urchin that's often harvested by a select group of commercial urchin divers, and they are known to primarily be feed in the detritus, so this sort of column of kelp that decomposes and from the canopy and drifts through the water column, and they will capture this detritus in a more or less stationary place. So there's a little bit of a different natural history here, but this has really come right home to Oregon. There's been many examples in Oregon where divers, conservationists, marine biologists, fishermen, urchin divers are seeing this incredible collapse of standing kelp in many places on the coast, particularly the South Coast, where there has historically been more kelp. Here's a before and after example. And so, we have to talk about the stable states. And so the urchin barren phenomenon is not a new phenomenon in nature necessarily. It's just that it has increased around the Pacific, where you have the growth of purple sea urchin populations that are unchecked, and they turn into these barrens. And urchin barren is essentially a carpet. The ocean floor is carpeted with urchins. And what's unique about urchins that is really different than other prey populations and their life history is that urchins can live in a dormant state. They can essentially come out of the crevices when there's no predators. They could mow down the kelp, and then when they run out of food, more or less, they can go into a sort of a dormancy, and they can live for decades like that. And that's what's so alarming about urchins, and this unique characteristic of their natural history, is that most prey populations, when they reach a certain density and when they eat themselves out of house and home, they usually, even without predators, they'll sort of suffer their own population collapse due to the loss of food and the increase in disease as they become more dense. And this is a fundamental aspect of many populations in nature, but urchins are unique, and they can sort of survive in this dormant state for decades on the ocean floor. So because of that, the urchin barren is known as a stable state. And the kelp ecosystem is another form of a stable state. And we've had this shift from the kelp ecosystem shifting to the urchin barren stable state due to the loss of these important predators. So it's a little bit of a difficult concept to wrap your head around, but that's basically the conceptual framework of what's going on in the Oregon's near shore. So why is kelp important? And many of you know the answer to this is kelp it captures the sun's energy and delivers the sun's energy into the marine ecosystem, which is really important. So it's a complex three-dimensional habitat, like a sort of an underwater forest. It's a nursery of biodiversity and productivity, especially for many fish species, and they're in various stages of their life history, especially the juvenile, larval juvenile stage in a lot of fish species, including salmon and rockfish. It's a critical habitat for marine fisheries. And it buffers ocean waves and currents. It captures and stores carbon. And we could go on and on and on about this. It delivers, the kelp detritus that washes up on the beach can be important habitat for insects, which birds eat, and on and on and on. So in Oregon, we have the bull kelp primarily, which is an annual, and so it'll grow and oftentimes essentially disappear during parts of the winter months and then regrow again. And the giant kelp, there's I think 1 or 2 places on the Oregon coast where you can find giant kelp, but it's really a California kelp, and it grows perennially. So how can we reverse this stable state? And this is really the context of the sea otter reintroduction question: is can we reverse this trend and go back to a more kelp dominated system, or at least recover kelp where they've been historically known to be? And this brings us to sea otters. So you've probably heard of sea otters as a keystone species, and a keystone species is really a species like beaver that have a disproportionate influence on their surroundings. It's their influence is beyond their immediate needs of food and space, and they have an effect that they affect the ecosystem structure and function. And so beaver is an example of a keystone species, and really sea otters is one, if not the most iconic example of that definition in ecology. And this knowledge about their influence on the ecosystem really started, for the most part, with beyond the indigenous perspectives on sea otters since time immemorial, which we're all sure that they understood this phenomenon very well. Jim Estes was really the first one to bring this into the discipline of science and ecology. And in the 70s, he started his master's project out on the Alaska, the Aleutian Islands. And it just so happened that he had this sort of perfect natural experiment, and where on Shemya and Chitka Island, one island had sea otters and one island didn't, due to the legacy of fur hunting. And so what he noticed was that when he went to one of these islands, where there were no sea otters, there was very little kelp and a lot of sea urchins. And when he went to the island that had sea otters, there was a lot of kelp and few sea urchins and a lot of fish. And so this was really the trigger in his brain, the light bulb moment that went off. And he has since done a lifetime of research on this topic, and many colleagues since him have repeated these studies. And this is a graph that gives kind of a basic idea: is that when you have no otters present, you have really no, you have a little bit more sea urchins on the forest floor, or on the ocean floor, and you have very little kelp. But when otters show up, you begin to see a dramatic increase in kelp and a fairly significant decrease in sea urchins. And then over a 10-year period, you have an exponential increase in kelp and almost a disappearance of sea urchins. So this is a simple way of discussing this or presenting this information. Another more nuanced studies have shown these sort of interactions with predators. And so in the case of, say, bald eagles would, in the absence of sea otters, they tended to eat more things like seagulls and waterfowl. And in the presence of sea otters, they tended to eat more fish. And similarly, in the fish abundance, the catch, when sea otters are present, there's much more fish in the environment for predators to eat. The diet of seagulls, he looked at that. When otters are present, they tend to eat more fish, types of prey and scavenge fish. And then when sea otters are absent, they tend to eat more shellfish and other things like that. So the effect of otters sort of cascades through the entire ecosystem. It's not just about kelp and urchins. And here's another study in the Haida Gwaii, and they're sort of repeating this thing, and they're seeing a lot of the same things that other researchers have seen in other parts, Haida Gwaii in British Columbia, where sea otters are absent. You have, on the left-hand side of this illustration, you have mostly urchins with some kelp, and then within about 6 years, less than 6 years of otters return, you have almost a complete disappearance of urchins, or very small urchins that are often found in crevices and abalone that are found in rocks and cracks and crevices, with a dramatic increase of kelp. And then finally, after 10 years, you see what you'd call sort of old growth kelp. I mean, a really dynamic, diverse assemblage of kelp and other macroalgae. But it's more than kelp. So sea otters also live in estuaries, and they dig and forage for clams and crabs in eelgrass habitat and seagrass habitat. And seagrass is really important for improved water quality in estuaries, for biological productivity of estuaries, habitat for salmonids and other juvenile fish, and also a major source of carbon sequestration. So why do otters benefit eelgrass? And so this is actually a fairly nuanced deal, and it was discovered by primarily from biologists in California. And there's a group of small sea slugs and snails that graze the algae that grows on the blades of eelgrass, and it sort of it is damaging to eelgrass. It limits their photosynthetic rates essentially, and so the algae does. So when you have these slugs and snails and these grazers, they help keep eelgrass sort of vibrant and healthy, and allow eelgrass to expand and grow. With the introduction of the invasive green crab or other crabs that are unchecked by predators, they eat a lot of those small sea slugs and snails. And when you put otters in the system, otters eat these crabs, and then all of a sudden you have a rapid increase in these small grazers, and eelgrass essentially flourishes. And so this is an interesting dynamic, but it's a similar cascading effect that we see in kelp. And so it's another example of this major benefit that sea otters have to the ecosystem. And here's just finally a little example of going back to kelp. This is just an example of the pounds of carbon that could be stored within a healthy kelp habitat versus a marine habitat without kelp. And so there's a dramatic benefit to more vibrant, healthier, productive stands of kelp. And this is a real phenomenon. We used to think that, well, sure, kelp captures carbon, but kelp eventually decomposes and it releases the carbon back into the water. But what scientists are recently understanding now is a lot of this drift kelp basically goes into sort of some deep water and is almost sequestered in very, very deep water. So there's some interesting science now that's showing that there is a net storage essentially of carbon from kelp and eelgrass. So before I go on, I wanted to just touch on the attempt to restore sea otters in Oregon. And this is, I'll just talk about this briefly because we get a lot of questions about this. Due to the testing of nuclear weapons on the Aleutian Islands, some biologists got together and captured a series of sea otters to move to other states and provinces. And some of these animals, 93, were translocated to Oregon, the Redfish Rocks and Nellie's Cove, Cape Arago. And so not a huge number of animals, and it was a one-time release in 1970 and 71. In terms of each site only had a one-time release of animals. And so here, after they were released, you can see that the population started off with very few animals. So a lot of them either died or they swam away, and eventually they disappeared. And in biology, this is known as sort of a population threshold. The natural mortality of any given animal is a set thing in a given environment. And so you have to have a certain number of them, a minimum threshold, a minimum number to have a viable population. And there's no question that they just were below that threshold right from the beginning. So I just wanted to talk about why that might be very briefly. In other places, like in Washington State, they had a similar loss of individuals in the initial reintroduction, but they had supplemental releases after that, and we think that was a key difference. So the Redfish Rocks release effort was some of these details were told to us by a retired fish and wildlife biologist, and the animals were brought from Alaska. They were put in holding pens that were floating in the bay there in Port Orford, tethered to a buoy ball. And instead of sort of putting them in cages and delivering them to the reef south of the Redfish Rocks Reef, south of Port Orford, they were actually towed in the open water with a boat, and during a very rough ocean period. And so we think that was probably, back in, this is the 70s, the discipline of wildlife management and wildlife conservation is really in its infancy. And so, Oregon's a difficult coastline, and this probably was a reason for the disappearance of a lot of those otters early on. The Cape Arago release was even really more extreme. They went around, they had to take them by boat to Cape Arago. And when they went around from Port Orford into the open ocean, they hit this sort of freak summer storm. And it was so bad that they had to actually release the sea otters in the open ocean. They couldn't even make it there. And some of the otters were lost in cages over the side of the boat. That's how bad it was. So, I think our belief is that, reintroductions are difficult, number one, and number two, this was really just a logistical snafu. But if we were to go forward and try a restoration again, some of the realities of this is that this process is going to take time. It's going to take cooperation with agencies and stakeholders. We're going to need some public support to go forward. And we really need to understand the risks and benefits and opportunities. So we need to sort of conduct assessments and feasibility studies and to make this reality. So, and we need to understand post-reintroduction, as I mentioned, what are some of the impacts that we should consider? And these really include, the benefits of the restored connection between sea otters to coastal Indian tribes, the improved habitat for a lot of fish species, the increased resilience of the ecosystem, and then what is potentially an economic boom relative to wildlife watching and tourism in coastal communities. But some of the conflicts are legitimate, and they're serious and deserve analysis. And these are the potential for competition with commercial and recreational crabbers and urchin divers and clam diggers and folks like that. So, the other question, and there's a lot of concern about this conflict, especially crabbing, and a lot of folks point to Southeast Alaska. And what I wanted to do really quickly here is show you the difference between the Southeast Alaska coastline and the Oregon coastline, which, everyone knows the Oregon coastline. It's a very beautiful coastline, but it's not particularly dynamic compared to Southeast Alaska, and just the sheer volume or the sheer myriad of sort of maze of inlets and coves and islands. And this map here on the left is really zoomed out. So as you zoom in, sea otter habitat is just almost, it's almost mind-boggling how much sea otter habitat's there. And so, conversely, on the Oregon coast, a lot of the coastline is a very straight north-south, straight as an arrow sort of thing, and a lot of it is sandy subtidal habitat. And so there is sea otter habitat in Oregon, but it's discrete places on the Oregon coast, separated by places that are not viable sea otter habitat. So it's important to really throw this context out there so that folks understand that there is a difference in the carrying capacity between these two regions. So a little bit about the Elakha Alliance. I'll try to make this fast. Sorry for talking forever here, but the Elakha Alliance actually was, and I think we mentioned, was co-founded by the late David Hatch, so Peter's dad. And he had a passion for sea otters, which was sparked in large part by archaeological results of some archaeological digs in the Oregon coast, including the discovery of a sea otter atlatl handle, which was a really cool story. And since then, Robert Bailey has picked up the ball in the last few years and tried to really re-energize the Elakha Alliance and get the show back on the road after some time where the board just basically dissolved a little bit after the passing of Dave. So our board right now represents a diverse group of conservationists, tribal leaders, and other folks that are really passionate advocates for the nearshore ecosystem and potential return of sea otters. And you can check this out on our website. Our mission is to restore a healthy population of sea otters to the Oregon coast, and in the process, help make Oregon's marine ecosystem more robust and resilient. and why. This is a lot of stuff we've already talked about. Restoring this diversity and biological activity to the ecosystem, increasing the resilience against changing ocean conditions, supporting long-term economic use of nearshore ocean and estuaries, and of course the cultural perspective of returning this connection to Oregon coastal tribes. So we have adopted some really important strategic initiatives that we're moving fairly fast on to assess the scientific and economic feasibility of sea otter restoration, help the region reach consensus on restoration, and if warranted, proceed with that. So what have we done in 2020? There's other stuff we've done, but in the last couple of years, but just for the sake of slide count here, I've been abbreviated this. And this year, what we have focused on is this first strategic initiative. We've begun the feasibility study. We held a scientific sea otter science symposium virtually. And we've also been working pretty hard on our consensus building. We've got a new website. We've co-produced some podcasts, Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter, webinars with partners, stakeholder meetings, community outreach, partner engagement. Some exciting news is that we've been working with staff, Senator Merkley's natural resource staff, and we were able to include some language in the 2021 fiscal year budget with the leadership of Merkley to direct the Fish and Wildlife Service to assess the feasibility of restoring sea otters across the West Coast. And so, as you may not know, there's an 800-mile gap between the population in Washington and California population. So that's exciting, and that really helps create a foundation for our work and a context for our work in a more broad continental scale. So we're going to complete the feasibility study this year, and we're intending to complete an economic impact assessment this year. Both of those things are underway. The economic impact assessment is really seeking to dive into these questions about the pros and cons of sea otters with respect to fisheries, shell fisheries, fin fisheries, coastal tourism, outdoor recreation, carbon sequestration, and other values. We're going to continue our consensus building. And so that's about it. If you want to learn more, check out our website, elakhalliance.org, where you can donate, and also you can sign up to receive the RAF newsletter. You can check out our podcast archive. We've got 9 episodes that deal with the kelp ecosystem, sea otters, archaeology on the coast with respect to marine resources, and I think you'd find it interesting. Check us out on social media, and also our YouTube channel, where we have a lot of the talks from the 2018 Sea Otter Symposium and the 2020 Sea Otter Symposium. And that's it. I'll open it up to any questions.
Great, thank you, John, and thank you, Peter. We have a few questions that have come in. So first, we have Sachi, who asks, how much did whaling of baleen whale populations impact sea otter population in the Pacific Northwest after post-fur trade restoration?
Yeah, and there's a fairly, I wouldn't say somewhat controversial still, but there's a theory that Jim Estes developed about that phenomenon, and it's a little complicated. I'll try to summarize it here. Where in the Aleutian Islands, what they noticed the recovery of sea otters in the Aleutian Islands, and once they were, they essentially naturally dispersed to many areas or reintroduced to many areas. So they noticed this long-term recovery, and then about in the 1990s, they started to notice a decline. And what they realized is that killer whales were starting to hunt and kill sea otters, significant numbers, to the point where it had significant population effects to sea otters in many of these islands. And they were confidently concluded it was killer whales. And what they think is either one, killer whales turned more of their focus on sea otters because of the decline in large marine mammals, large whales, due to the legacy of whaling. And similarly, or alternatively, that a decline in the populations of certain seal species could have also caused that transfer, that switch. So there is some indication or a theory out there, and it's controversial and it's debated, but there's essentially no question that the killer whales on the Aleutians are affecting sea otter populations.
Thank you. Carla Cole says, thank you. Seems like Willapa Bay would have been full of sea otters in the past. What do you think of its current potential as a sea otter recovery site?
You know, I'm going to sort of pass on that in the sense that we're really waiting for the feasibility team to make those assessments, and they're the leading sea otter biologists on the West Coast, literally. I think it's likely that any any estuary of some size would have been suitable habitat for sea otters. One thing that the bays offer, the estuaries offer, is some protection from, the Oregon is such an exposed coastline. And although sea otters would have been on the coastline in many places, the bays, I think Oregon's got an unusually exposed, coastline compared to some of that more dynamic coastline that I mentioned in Southeast Alaska. But yeah, that's really all I can say at this point. Is the feasibility study folks will definitely be, making that determination.
Thank you. Cheryl asks, is optimal crab habitat in the same locations as optimal otter habitat?
Yeah, I think that's also a dynamic question that those feasibility study folks will be looking at. I can say that in Oregon, you can find Dungeness crabs in sandy subtidal habitats, right, where you're really not going to find sea otters in large extents. If you have a kelp habitat, a rocky subtidal habitat that can support kelp, and sea otters are there, of course, and they can help expand that to the extent that kelp can capture on the bottom on rocky surfaces. But the sandy subtidal habitats, if it's close by, sea otters would probably go after crabs there, but that's just only within a certain distance of where their home base is around kelp. So I think there's likely to be areas where they do overlap and they are eating a lot of Dungeness crab, for example. And there's going to be pretty large areas on the Oregon coast, especially the north coast, central north coast, where it's just vast stretches of sandy subtidal habitat. And so there's also been some research about this in California. A new study and was trying to ask this question: are sea otters having a negative effect on the harvest rates of Dungeness crab? And they found that not only were they not having a negative effect, that it appeared that the Dungeness fishery was increasing with an expanding sea otter population. What we think is going on there potentially is that sea otters are creating a more productive estuary where crabs are breeding and reproducing. And although they eat bigger crabs, their net effect of their presence in the ecosystem, because the ecosystem is more productive, is essentially a more productive crab population, even though locally they might be eating bigger crabs.
Interesting, thank you. Andrea asks a question, which is similar to my personal question that I have about this. What are the differences between northern and southern sea otters? Is one subspecies better suited to Oregon's habitats? And my question that I'm jumping on that question with is, are there genetic differences between the otters that are on the different in the different areas?
Yeah, if you get on Google, and look at, you can find it on our website in our news page. But if you Google Hannah Wellman sea otters in Oregon or something like that, you'll get a bunch of news stories about the research that from the University of Oregon, from Hannah Wellman, who's a PhD student, where they were trying to answer a lot of these questions. And so there has been a fair amount of genetic work conducted on sea otters. I don't think there's, functionally speaking, a big difference between the two subspecies. They are disconnected as much due to the legacy of fur hunting than sort of disconnected in reality. In other words, there was probably a certain amount of natural gene flow across the Pacific coast. In Oregon, we think it was a transitional zone, and the genetic analysis seems to indicate that Oregon was a transitional zone between the two, and there's both of those types have been discovered in the archaeological record, where archaeologists are digging up otter bones and shellfish middens of some of the coastal tribes, and they're finding both northern and southern types in Oregon. And so I would encourage, though, folks to go check out some of the news stories about that work and to get more information.
Thank you. From Carla Cole, is there any teak, as in traditional ecological knowledge, around otters being harvested for meat or food, or only for their pelts?
Yeah, I'm going to hand this over to Peter also, but before I do, there has been a researcher out of University of Oregon. It's actually Hannah Wellman's major professor, Madonna Moss, who actually conducted this exact research. And we have a podcast episode on our website where I interview Madonna. So check out that episode. It's the last episode in the series. And what she found and is that at least in the Alaska area, in the Tlingit community, she believes pretty strongly through her analysis that they were not using sea otters for human consumption. The meat is of sort of lower quality, and that they were feeding the meat to dogs primarily, but they were really focusing on the fur, just because compared to other marine mammals like seals, sea otter, was just not a high quality, food for them. But the furs were obviously extraordinary. So that at least is from Alaska, and I don't know if Peter has anything to add to that.
No, I mean, and here in the Oregon context, it's similar. All interviews with presents or departed elders talk almost exclusively about the fur. I think that there's some more evidence of butchered bone here in some Oregon middens, that it might be a little bit more of a mixed bag in terms of the past about whether sea otters were eaten, but I'll have to go back and look at Hannah Wellman citations, and that's the author to look for if you want to learn more.
Thank you. Questions keep coming in. Sachi has another question. What do you think about small commercial kelp farming and how it might support sea otter restoration or not?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that kelp farming would be necessarily a positive or necessarily a negative, in the sense that, it's maybe good for carbon sequestration, among other things, but it's the activity surrounding the kelp farm would be a fair amount of disturbance, and if it's being grown and then removed, it's really not necessarily benefiting sea otters. I mean, of course, sea otters really have a positive effect on kelp. So if they're in an area that has a really low % cover of kelp and you put sea otters in there, they're going to potentially increase that over time. But yeah, unless you were to sort of farm kelp and not harvest it, that might be a benefit to putting sea otter, to reintroducing them, just because they have some kelp to sort of arrive home to, in other words. But I don't see it as necessarily a positive connection to sea otter conservation.
Nadia asks, is there any effort in Washington to help otters move down the coast from the Olympic? Tribal participation?
Not that I know of. It's a controversial topic in the commercial crab fishery folks and others might be concerned about an expanding population. And from what I've heard from sea otter researchers is that I wouldn't say it's a complete, no-go thing, but it sounds, from what I've heard, unlikely that there's going to be, efforts in the near future to expand the sea otter population in Washington South. And that's just from what I've heard. I don't know any more than that. There could be some possibility that, opportunities will arise, but it's I haven't heard of them.
And I think this might be our last question. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. Rachel's son wants to know, how fast are sea otters?
Fast?
Yes, fast. Maybe how fast do they swim?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with on land, because a lot of the sightings of sea otters are often turn out to be the North American river otter, which does occupy marine areas, and they, of course, tend to move on all 4 feet pretty quickly. They can run. The North American river otter and they have claws on all 4 feet, and all 4 feet are similar size, so they're pretty agile weasels on the ground. Whereas the sea otter really has a hind legs that look more like a fur seal. They can't move at all. They're pretty clumsy on the ground. But in the water, you know, they can swim. They tend not to swim in a straight line necessarily super fast a lot unless they're getting chased by a killer whale. There's a videotape on, if you go to YouTube and you look up sea otter killer whale, you'll find a video there of a sea otter swimming for its life from a killer whale, and it jumps into a boat, and that could give you an idea of how fast they could swim.
Thank you. I'll have to check that out. Well, that is all of the questions that we have for you. Thank you so much. Thank you both, John and Peter and Margaret, for organizing this presentation. I've definitely learned a lot, and we've had quite a intriguing crowd and lots of really good feedback. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.